Figure it out.
Hello, this is Adam Koralik from Figured Out Productions. The following video is a video of some kind, and I hope you enjoy it.
Hey guys, it's Adam here, and today we're going to be talking about this. This is the RetroTink 2X Pro M, or Multiformat. This is the latest in the line of the RetroTinks from Mike Chi, and before we go into the details of it, I do want to give a quick shout out to Mike himself, because he was cool enough to send this to me for free for the purposes of review. So if you like it or any of the other previous RetroTinks, all of which I've done videos on, there's a link in the description. Give him support him, because this guy, I've said it before, this dude is doing a lot to make the retro gaming experience much better for a lot of people. Not only with these devices, but also, you know, his work has kind of gone into other things like the Rad 2X and so on and so forth. So he's doing a lot, whether or not you recognize it. If you're a retro gamer and you're like, hey, I'm gonna get that cable that's gonna make my old game consoles look better, there's a good chance Mike, you know, in maybe a 5 degrees from Kevin Bacon type of way, had something to do with it. So I want to give a shout out to him on that basis alone. But also thank you to him for sending this to me so that we can all talk about it now. Now, yes, the core purpose of this device is the same thing that we've talked about a million times on this channel. Let's take our old video game consoles, plug them into a thing, and have it look better on a modern television. So how is this any different? Well, this one actually specifically addresses a very niche problem, but it wouldn't be this channel if I wasn't talking about something niche. So the previous versions of this, the original model, this is the RetroTink 2X Pro, and then there's the Scart edition. Each one kind of addressed a different thing. I mean, I've done videos on all of them, but basically this one was the core concept of here's Mike's introduction. Here's what I'm going to do to simplify it so you don't all need to go out and buy a FrameMeister. You can just get this. You make some sacrifices, but it's still basically a good experience. But he addressed a lot of the problems, upgraded it, and that's how you got the Pro, which is actually the one that, even by his own admission on his website, or if you just talk to him, he will say this is most likely the version you are going to want, and we'll get back to that. However, even for another niche group that's like, I don't need component or S-Video or composite, I need Scart, he even got that covered, and there you go. Now, this is a good device. But this one was made for a very specific set of consoles, and it was really everything that came out prior to the Dreamcast, meaning, you know, the N64, the 3DO, the PlayStation 1, the NES, the Master System, the Genesis, what have you. This is where that's supposed to go. And there was a flaw with it that wasn't really his fault. It was just something he had to deal with, and I've explained in detail what that is. But in short, a lot of the older consoles use an RGB mode on board. And in North America, anyway, we never had a way to access it. In Europe, they got Scart. So if you plugged a Scart cable into, say, a Mega Drive, you could tap into the RGB signal and get a much cleaner picture than we were able to get in North America through composite or S-Video. Granted, the Genesis didn't natively have S-Video cables ever released, but, well, not here anyway. But point is, because North America never had an option, the best he could do is be like, look, we did get component. You can tap into RGB via a component, it's just you need cables. So other companies like HD Retrovision made those cables. So if you really want to get all the pieces together, yes, you can do that. You can make your Sega Genesis look amazing. It's going to add up, but he gave you the options. But he had no choice. There's no other third magical format that exists. But the other problem that comes out of that is people look at this, and I did as well all the way back on the first model. I look at it and I go, cool, it's got component on it. I'm going to connect a component console like the original Xbox or the GameCube. You can't. I mean, you can, but you can't. In the sense that you can, it will technically work because, okay, this device, it only supports up to 480i input. If you try to give it anything higher, like 480p or 720p, it just kind of freaks out because it wasn't meant for that. So it just is fundamentally strange. You're looking at it like, for example, if you're the guy out there who's like, oh, dude, I love the Wii. I can't wait. I want to play the Wii on this, and I'm going to use it as a component to HDMI converter. Yay. The problem is you plug in a Wii, which supports 480p. Almost every single game on it does. You plug it in, and it's just not going to function. So it's just going to be kind of mind-melting to a lot of people. And so he wanted to address that problem. Enter the RetroTink 2X Pro M. Multiformat that is specifically designed for exactly that situation. If you're the guy out there who has a Wii, a GameCube, a PlayStation 2, an original Xbox, and of course the Nuon Master Race, if you're those guys, this is what that was for. And possibly Dreamcast. That one's a little special because the Dreamcast does support high def modes, but never had component cables officially released. I know HD Retrovision's been working on them for a while, so it might support that. I honestly don't know because I don't have the capacity to test that at this point in our history, but I assume it would work. But the thing about that was that he wanted to just make it a free upgrade for the Pro. I talked to him about this too. He was just like, yeah, I wanted to put in 480p support at the very least through a firmware update, because if you put in 480p support, you would at least cover all of the GameCube support. You would cover all of the Wii support. You'd cover a major chunk of, a chunk of PlayStation 2 support. And then a big chunk of original Xbox. Majority. Not all of original Xbox, but a big chunk. But unfortunately, he determined that just wasn't hardware level possible. So he had to go in and redesign an entirely new board. And out of that came, once again, the RetroTink 2X Pro M. But that actually came with some sacrifices. See, the thing is, the original model, like I said, was catered to older consoles. So it has a lot of different modes in it with a lot of different features for different levels of video processing and filtering and things like scan lines, all that type of stuff. It's all under the hood here, but for a very specific category of consoles. A lot of that had to go in order for this to function. This device is, while it will technically work, if you're like, hey man, I want to plug my Genesis into that one, can I do it? Yes. But the image will not be quite as good as it would be on this. Mike is very clear about this on his website. If you have a console before 6th gen, go with this. So I will reiterate that sentiment. This is really, I'm only going to review this from the standpoint of someone who would care to use it for its intended purpose, which is 6th gen consoles. And even in that case, you do kind of throw out the nuance just because it doesn't support high def modes. So that being the case, how does it fare? And the answer is pretty well. Its primary focus is its 480p mode. Now the 480p mode has two options, which is just a pass-through mode is option A, and that's exactly what it sounds like. It'll take the input of any 480p signal. Again, the consoles that would be recommended for that are the Wii, where almost every single game, if not every single game, actually does support 480p natively. The GameCube, where natively half do, but if you're using something like Swiss, 100% of the library will work. And you'll get advantage of the high def modes. The PlayStation 2 is an odd one because there's 5,000 games on the PlayStation 2 and only about 180 actually support 480p mode. So yay, those will work now. It's just that in most cases, like I said, the PlayStation 2 is least guilty of this because it doesn't support it. So in most of the time, that actually would work just fine with the original. But if you're going to upgrade in that sense, the PlayStation 2 is well suited to this device. And then the original Xbox, which is, I think, personally the most interesting case, because there are some games on that console that are stuck at 480i, but almost every game supports 480p. But then it also supports 720p, but we'll get back to that in a second. So now you can enjoy that era of consoles. Now with the 480p mode, you basically have two settings. If you look at the device itself, you'll see there are various buttons. One for input that allows you to cycle between the three sources. But again, we're not going over that. We're really just talking about component. But I will say, just so I've said it, there is an S-Video jack on the side. And while you don't see a composite, aka the yellow port, it does exist. It's just the green one. The green one for component also doubles as the yellow port for composite. You just have to plug the yellow cable in there and then press the input option until you cycle around to composite input. But again, he doesn't recommend it, and I certainly don't recommend it. But because composite is gross, but it does work. So then on the side you have this comb feature, and you have the comb feature has retro and auto mode. That is a subtle type of difference thing. In most cases, if you're using 6th gen stuff, it's recommended to kind of keep it in auto mode. The other mode option is the pass-through and the line 2x. Now, pass-through, as I was discussing before, just takes the original signal, whatever it is, and just throws it through, and again, just treats it as a component HDMI signal converter. Done. Which is actually nice because there aren't really very many good component HDMI converters. In fact, even the FrameMeister does a bad job with that. So it's kind of nice that this actually does a pretty good job. But if you put it in line 2x mode, that's where the additional bonus features tend to work. Now, the only additional feature is a filter mode. Like the original RetroTinks, what they would do is they would take the signal from 480i or under, and they would line double until they reached 480p, so that at least it was enough of a standard signal that it would work on a modern television. and then on top of that you had filter modes to kind of buff out the image. The buffing being the kind of the more unique part. This has a buffering mode for 480p content. However, it doesn't really work all that well, and Mike's very clear about that. It's basically experimental. It uses some non-standard timings, which can cause some issues. So I'll show you what I'm talking about. If you put it up on certain televisions, it's like you'll get a display, but it'll just kind of flicker. This only happened on one TV that I tested it with. My primary TV had no such issue, and Mike says that himself. It most of the time will work with a television. The TV won't care, but various devices do. The same goes with capture devices. He said specifically that it was probably going to have issues with capture devices, and it did. However, I did get it to work with one, which was the Cloner Alliance Flint 4K P+. That one didn't care. It was fine with it. It was, however, not compatible with the M Classic, notably, which I thought was strange, but it was true. In that mode, it couldn't work. So to give you an example of what I'm talking about here, I have Simpson's Hit and Run. This is an original Xbox game that is natively 480p compatible. So I put it in, and here it is running in the Passthrough mode. Now the Passthrough mode is this is just what the game looks like. And I thought, okay, let me go ahead and activate the filter mode, and let's buff it out a little. You probably didn't notice a difference. It does exist, but it's extremely finite. And you're talking about a guy who loves to meticulously focus on these little weird, oh, look how much slightly better it is. And even I was like, hey, I can barely tell. But if you add something like the M Classic to the pass-through mode, that's when it ends up looking a lot nicer, but that's not really surprising because the 6th gen and the M Classic are a marriage made in heaven, and this thing is a great mediator for that. As Mike says, it's basically just kind of a bonus mode, and you really should treat it as such because it's experimental and doesn't really seem to do a whole lot to my eyes. But yeah, I would honestly, for the most part, unless you're just straight up playing the games, you're not recording anything, you're not trying to use an M Classic, you're not trying to do anything, you're just plugging it in, you already bought it, and your TV actually works with it, then sure, keep that mode on. But, it's a small difference. I should also mention for European users, this does support 576p pass-through. However, I really have nothing to test that with, but according to Mike, it does work. And then there's the 720p input. It actually does support 1080i input as well, but that's so ridiculously rare. Even the original Xbox only had 5 games that supported it. And even then, it's not recommended because it's not good looking originally. 720p actually, frankly, looks a lot better than 1080i. But anyway, so I decided to test out the 720p mode. Now, 720p via component, at least, is kind of rare when it comes to video game consoles. There's only a couple consoles that technically even support it. PlayStation 2 technically supports it, but I don't think there's a single game that even uses it. The original Xbox is the least guilty of this problem. About 100 games on the original Xbox, maybe 10% of its library, support native 720p. That's it. The only other 2 consoles that support it is PlayStation 3 and the Xbox 360, both of which there's no reason to use through component for the most part, unless you're just that guy out there who's like, hey man, I have the original launch model of the 360 that somehow has not got red rings of death, and I don't want to get a replacement that has native HDMI, and I for some reason want to put the money down for this. I just don't understand that scenario. It's not impossible that exists, but okay. And then there's also the PlayStation 3. That one's a little more forgivable because if you're the guy who's like, hey, I want to play the PlayStation 3 and I want to capture footage, the PS3 does have HDCP coding in its HDMI output, meaning you can't unless you know how to bypass it, which frankly is what you should do instead. But you could be the guy who's like, no, I'm just going to use the component output and then I want to convert it to HDMI, which again, I would not recommend at all, but technically you could do that. But in both instances, 720p is kind of your cap. This thing does not support 1080p input. But whatever. Point is, you got those 4 consoles, you can essentially eliminate 3 of them, leaving really just the original Xbox. So I decided, okay, I'm going to fire up the original Xbox and pop in Soul Calibur 2, which is one of the games that supports 720p. Well, technically, that's not how I found out. I will show you footage of Soul Calibur 2. The game I tested initially was Justice League Heroes, just to see what it would do. And I'll show you here. It went nuts. It did not look good. It was not working right. It comes up as this pink, nightmare. And I was like, wow, what is happening here? This doesn't seem right. So I swapped out all the cables and I was trying everything. It just always did that. So then I went to Mike himself and I was like, we're 720p, right? Because like this is what's happening. And so he's trying to work it with me, and then we both come to the conclusion that something's wrong. And he goes like, I think I sent you a bad unit, dude. I'll just replace it. I'll send you a new one. And I was like, whatever, that's cool. A couple hours later, he messages me again. He's like, I figured it out. And I was like, what happened? He's like, yeah, so the firmware I've had on the site for this was the wrong one. I never noticed because nobody said anything. He's like, he basically made a joke about like, it shows how nobody really uses the 720p input mode if nobody said anything about it in all this time. So he fixed it. He sent that update to me and I installed it, which you should do, by the way. You should update to the latest firmware. It's really easy. You download there's an installer you can download off his website as well as the firmware. And it takes like a couple of minutes, if that. Always do that. But anyway, so I go ahead and I do that. Then it starts working. So then you can see there proof of it. Justice League Heroes running at 720p. But yeah, it was funny. He tweeted about it and he was like, yeah, my bad. Thanks, Adam, blah, blah, blah. So yeah, and there was only even one person who said like, I wondered why my PS3 didn't work, but it just figured it wasn't compatible. But yes, so you're welcome, everybody. But apparently such a niche feature that, you know, whatever. Anyway, let's show you some examples of that though. Soul Calibur 2 is the one I decided to capture footage of. Now, this is running through the pass-through mode in 720p, and if I didn't say it before, I apologize, but the 720p mode only does pass-through. The enhancement mode is not an option. It just takes what it gets and throws it back out. So if you want to do any sort of enhancement, as I've said before, what you'll essentially need is the M Classic. You can throw that in there and you'll get that's where it'll do all the buffering and the color enhancement and all that sort of stuff. And it's a much nicer, cleaner picture, to be completely frank about it. So, like, honestly, in the end, final thoughts, this is designed for a very niche group of consoles, and an even nicher group of people who would want to upgrade those consoles who haven't already done so. This is, I mean, to the point where, you know, it's had a bug firmware for a while for what is supposed to be a big feature, and nobody even noticed, until me. You know what I'm saying? So, like, this is cool, but really the scenario is like, if you're like, hey dude, I have the older ones, is this like an upgrade? Not really. It's like an alternative, because Mike himself will still recommend that this is what you're going to want most of the time. This one is just PS2, GameCube, Wii, and Xbox. That's it. I mean, it'll work with the new on again, but like, that's it. That's your wheelhouse. That's all it focuses on. And that's fine, but in those consoles cases, I would say with the original Xbox, if you can get, I've done a video on it, if you can get the chimeric HDMI adapter, and I know there's already now the HDMI boards that exist, probably people are going to want to go with those. And the GameCube has things like the GCHD, and it has native HDMI boards as well. The Wii, this actually does make some sense. Because there are not good HDMI cables for the Wii. There's like junk ones by Hyperkin and so on. There are HDMI mods, but then there's also Wii U's that solve that problem for you, which is actually what I've recommended. The PlayStation 2, this is actually a pretty good solution, to keep it real with you, because the component output on that, you know, that would allow every PS2 game to work, essentially, and work better. So the PS2, this is perfect. The other ones, it would really have to be the guy who has those other consoles but hasn't decided to upgrade in any of those cables. Then this is good because it's a budget option to make all those look good. But even in that scenario, you have to be the guy who has GameCube component cables, which are obscenely rare. I mean, it'll work, but they're rare. So understand all of those parameters before going into it. And as I said, I want to make very clear, again, it does work with the older consoles. It's just not recommended. So, yeah, it depends on really your preferences on which consoles you're trying to upgrade. That said, for what it's supposed to be, a component to HDMI converter that is designed for things that support 480p and 720p and 1080i, it does that very well. It's just how practical that is for most people, probably kind of limited. But that said, if you are that guy The link's in the description. You can check it out. You can get this. You can get the older models. You can even get the Scart edition, which is actually the one I use the most, to keep it real with you. And you'll get a good product out of it. That much I can tell you. Just make sure you understand where your needs are and use that to decide which one would be best suited for you. So that'll about do it, I think. Thank you very much for watching. Thanks again to Mike for the hookup here. If you could, please go to the description, check out the social media stuff, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, Patreon, what have you. And as well as like, comment, and subscribe. Appreciate that too. Thank you very much, and I'll see you all later.